Some marriages don't fall apart. They just never feel right, and you live with that feeling for years. If you've been quietly regretting your marriage, questioning yourself, doubting your choices, and wondering why this feeling never goes away, stay here. Because there's a reason this regret exists, and there is a way to understand what to do next. When a woman says she has always regretted her marriage, it almost never means that something suddenly went wrong. It means that from the very beginning, something didn't fully align, and she learned how to live around that feeling instead of listening to it. At first, the regret doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't show up as panic or heartbreak. It shows up as quiet discomfort, a sense of heaviness you can't quite explain, a feeling that something is missing, even though everything looks fine. Moments where you feel strangely distant from your own life. You tell yourself this is normal. That marriage isn't supposed to feel exciting. That stability matters more than feelings. That real life isn't like movies. So you stay. And you adapt. You lower expectations without realizing you're doing it. You stop asking certain questions. You stop bringing up certain feelings. Because it feels easier to manage disappointment than to face what those feelings might mean. Over time, the regret doesn't disappear. It becomes background noise. You build routines. You function. You show up. You do what needs to be done. From the outside, your marriage looks acceptable. There are no obvious red flags. No constant fighting. No dramatic betrayal. And that's what makes it so confusing. Because nothing feels bad enough to justify leaving. But nothing feels right enough to feel truly alive. This is where many women get stuck for years. Regret like this doesn't scream. It whispers. It shows up in the way you feel relieved when he's not around. In the way your body tightens when he enters the room. In the way you stop imagining a future and start managing the present instead. You don't feel heartbroken. You feel numb. And numbness is often mistaken for peace. But numbness isn't peace. It's what happens when emotional needs have been unmet for too long. Many women blame themselves at this stage. They tell themselves they're ungrateful, too sensitive, too demanding. They look at other couples and wonder why everyone else seems content, while they feel quietly empty in a marriage that should be fine. They try harder. They become more understanding, more patient, more accommodating. They shrink their needs to keep the relationship stable. But the regret doesn't go away. It deepens. Because this kind of regret isn't about one mistake. It's about misalignment. About living a life that looks acceptable on the outside, but doesn't feel true on the inside. And the longer you ignore that misalignment, the quieter you become. You stop checking in with yourself. You stop trusting your reactions. You stop asking what you actually want. You measure your worth by how much discomfort you can tolerate, by how well you can endure emotional distance, by how little you need. This isn't strength. It's survival. And survival inside a marriage slowly erodes intimacy, attraction, and self-respect. At some point, you may even forget what feeling connected to yourself used to feel like. You go through the motions. You play the role. You convince yourself this is what adulthood looks like. But something inside you keeps pulling at you. Quietly. Persistently. Not because you're ungrateful. Not because you're broken. But because your inner truth hasn't stopped existing. Part 1 is not about judging your past choices. It's about understanding why this regret exists at all. Because until you understand that, every decision you make will come from fear, guilt, or confusion, instead of clarity. And clarity is the only place from which real choices can be made. One of the most confusing parts about long-term regret in a marriage is that it doesn't fade with time. You expect it to. You think that if you stay long enough, if you try hard enough, if you adjust enough, the feeling will eventually disappear. But it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is not because you're weak, or indecisive, or incapable of commitment. It's because this kind of regret isn't emotional noise. It's a signal. At first, you interpret it as restlessness, then as dissatisfaction, then as boredom, then as a phase. You tell yourself, every relationship goes through this. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe this is just adulthood. So instead of listening to the signal, you learn how to silence it. You stay busy. You focus on responsibilities. You distract yourself with routine. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop asking yourself the most important question. How do I actually feel in this marriage? Not how it looks. Not how it should be. Not how others would judge it. But how it feels inside your body. Inside your nervous system. Inside your sense of self. Because regret that doesn't go away is usually tied to something deeper than circumstances. It's tied to a fundamental mismatch. A mismatch between who you are and how you're allowed to exist in this relationship. You may not feel unsafe. You may not feel abused. You may not even feel deeply unhappy, but you feel unseen, unchosen, unnecessary. You start to notice that you edit yourself. You hold back reactions. You simplify your thoughts. You make yourself smaller so things can stay calm. Over time, this becomes normal. You stop noticing how often you compromise, how rarely you feel genuinely excited to share something, how little space there is for your inner world. And because nothing explodes, because there's no dramatic breaking point, you stay. This is where many women misinterpret the situation. They think, if it were really wrong, I'd feel worse. If it were really bad, I wouldn't function. If it were really a problem, I wouldn't be able to keep going. But emotional misalignment doesn't always hurt loudly. It drains quietly. It shows up as chronic doubt, as emotional fatigue, as a constant low-level disappointment you can't quite name. You might even convince yourself that the regret is your own issue to fix, that if you worked on yourself more, became calmer, more appreciative, less sensitive, it would go away. So you turn inward. You self-correct. You self-silence. But the regret stays, because it isn't caused by a lack of effort. It's caused by a lack of resonance. You are in a relationship where your emotional frequency is never fully met, and your system knows this, even if your mind keeps rationalizing it. That's why the regret resurfaces in quiet moments, late at night, in the morning before the day starts, in moments when you imagine a different life, and feel both relief and guilt. This isn't because you're ungrateful. It's because part of you knows you've been living slightly out of alignment for a long time, and no amount of logic can erase a truth your body has been holding on to. Part 2 is about understanding this. Regret that persists isn't asking you to panic. It's asking you to listen, because ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. It only makes you disappear instead. After a woman recognizes that regret has been living inside her for years, the next step often feels logical, but it's where many get stuck. They try to solve the feeling instead of understanding it. This is the most common and most damaging mistake, treating long-term regret like a problem that needs fixing, instead of a message that needs interpretation. At this stage, many women turn inward even more. They analyze themselves. They question their reactions. They ask whether they're being fair, reasonable, grateful enough. They look for ways to make the regret go away, without disrupting the life they've built. They tell themselves, maybe if I communicate better, maybe if I work on myself more, maybe if I become calmer, softer, more accepting. So they try to adjust again. They read, they reflect, they rationalize, they minimize. But the regret doesn't respond to self-improvement, because it isn't coming from a flaw in you. It's coming from a dynamic that no longer allows you to be fully present as yourself. The mistake is believing that if you just understand the situation better, you'll finally feel at peace inside it. But understanding without boundaries doesn't bring peace. It brings deeper exhaustion. You begin to intellectualize your pain. You explain it. You justify it. You normalize it. And in doing so, you stay. You stay not because you want to, but because leaving feels too disruptive, too dramatic, too unjustified. This is where regret becomes chronic. Because instead of asking, what does this feeling require from me? You ask, how do I make this feeling stop? And those are two very different questions. Regret that lasts this long is rarely asking you to fix the relationship. It's asking you to stop betraying your own experience inside it. But betrayal doesn't always look dramatic. Often it looks responsible, mature, controlled. It looks like staying quiet to keep the peace, like lowering expectations to avoid disappointment, like convincing yourself that what you feel isn't important enough to act on. Over time, this creates an internal split. Part of you knows the truth. Another part keeps managing life as if that truth doesn't exist. You function. You smile. You fulfill roles. But internally, you feel increasingly disconnected from your own voice. This is why many women feel both regretful and guilty at the same time. They regret staying, and they feel guilty for even thinking about leaving. This emotional conflict keeps them frozen. Because as long as regret is framed as a personal weakness, it can be managed. But once it's seen as a signal, it demands a response. Part 3 is about recognizing that the real mistake isn't staying too long. It's silencing yourself while you stay. And the longer that silence continues, the harder it becomes to hear your own needs clearly. This doesn't mean you must leave. It doesn't mean drastic action is required. But it does mean that continuing to live as if nothing is wrong comes at a cost. And that cost is you. At this point, many women ask themselves the same quiet question. If this regret isn't going away, what does it actually mean? And the most important shift happens right here. Because this feeling is not trying to tell you that you made a bad choice, or that you failed, or that your marriage is a mistake. It's trying to show you something much more precise. Long-term regret in a marriage usually isn't about the relationship itself. It's about the role you've been forced to live inside it. You didn't necessarily choose the wrong person, but over time you may have been pushed into a version of yourself that no longer feels real. A version that adapts too much, waits too long, carries more than she should. This is why the regret feels so confusing. Because on paper, nothing is wrong enough. But internally, something essential has been missing. You may notice that your needs exist, but they don't have space. Your thoughts exist, but they aren't fully received. Your emotional world exists, but it doesn't shape the relationship. You are present, but not influential. Over time, this creates a quiet imbalance. Not necessarily because your partner is cruel or malicious, but because the dynamic allows your inner experience to remain secondary. You become the one who adjusts, the one who understands, the one who waits. And the longer this goes on, the more your system reacts. Not with anger, not with drama, but with withdrawal. You stop investing emotionally. You stop initiating deeply. You stop imagining shared futures. And this withdrawal often gets misunderstood. From the outside, it looks like distance, like indifference, like emotional coldness. But internally, it's self-protection. It's what happens when a woman realizes, consciously or not, that showing up fully no longer feels safe or meaningful. This is the moment where many women feel ashamed. They think, what's wrong with me? Why don't I feel the way I should? Why can't I just be happy? But nothing is wrong with you. Your system is responding logically to a long-term lack of emotional reciprocity. Part 4 is about understanding this clearly. Regret is not a verdict. It's feedback. Feedback that the way you've been living inside this marriage is no longer sustainable. Not because you're weak, but because you've outgrown the role you were placed in. This doesn't automatically mean the relationship must end, but it does mean that continuing exactly as before will deepen the disconnect. The question shifts here. Not, how do I make this feeling go away? But, what would need to change for me to feel like myself again in this relationship? That question doesn't demand immediate answers, but it demands honesty. And honesty is the first real movement out of long-term regret. Once a woman understands that the regret is not about failure, but about a role that no longer fits, the question naturally shifts again. Not to what should I do next, but to something much quieter and more important. How do I stop disappearing inside my own life? Because the real damage of long-term regret is not the relationship itself. It's the slow erosion of self-trust. Over time, you stop trusting your reactions. You stop trusting your discomfort. You stop trusting the part of you that knows when something isn't right. You begin to override yourself. You explain away tension. You justify imbalance. You minimize disappointment. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to feel grounded inside your own experience. This is why many women feel stuck even after gaining insight. They see the dynamic clearly, but still feel unable to move. Not because they lack courage, but because they've lost connection to their own authority. Part 5 is about reclaiming that authority, without confrontation, without ultimatums, without dramatic declarations. The first shift doesn't happen outwardly. It happens internally. It begins when you stop organizing your life around avoiding discomfort, when you stop cushioning other people from the consequences of emotional distance, when you stop translating your needs into something easier for others to digest. This doesn't mean becoming cold. It means becoming honest. You begin to notice when you overfunction, when you carry responsibility that isn't yours, when you initiate connection that isn't reciprocated, and instead of correcting it, you pause. You let the imbalance be visible, first to yourself. This is where power begins to return. Not power over another person, but power over your own presence. Because the moment you stop filling every gap, the dynamic is forced to reveal itself. Either the relationship adjusts, or it becomes undeniable what it has been relying on. This is not manipulation. It's reality. A relationship that only works when one person continuously compensates is not balanced. It's dependent. And dependency breeds resentment, not connection. The mistake many women make at this stage is trying to communicate this shift verbally. Before they embody it, they explain, they justify, they negotiate. But real change doesn't come from better explanations. It comes from altered behavior, from no longer rescuing, from no longer smoothing, from no longer carrying what was never yours. This is uncomfortable because it breaks familiar patterns, because it creates silence where there used to be effort, because it exposes what was hidden by your constant presence. But this discomfort is productive. It's the discomfort of alignment, not self-betrayal. Part 5 is about understanding this clearly. You don't regain yourself by demanding change. You regain yourself by stopping the patterns that required you to disappear. And when you do that, the relationship finally has a chance to respond to the real you, not the version that has been surviving quietly for years. At this stage, something important begins to change. Not in the relationship yet, but inside you. You stop asking the question, how do I make this work? And you begin asking a very different one. What kind of life am I actually living? The shift is subtle, but it's the most powerful one, because for the first time, you are no longer measuring your choices by how much discomfort they prevent. You are measuring them by truth. You begin to notice how your body reacts to certain conversations, to certain silences, to certain routines. You realize that clarity doesn't come from thinking harder, but from paying attention differently. You stop chasing certainty, and instead, you start observing reality as it is, not as you hope it will be, not as it once was, not as it should be, but as it consistently shows up. This is where the question of what now finally becomes grounded, not dramatic, not urgent, but real. You begin to see patterns clearly. Who initiates? Who carries? Who adjusts? Who avoids? And instead of trying to fix these patterns, you allow them to be visible. You stop protecting the relationship from the truth of how it functions. This doesn't mean confrontation. It means presence. You no longer rush to fill silence. You no longer smooth tension. You no longer translate your needs into something smaller. You let your experience exist without defending it. This is when the dynamic starts to respond, not always in the way you expect, but in the way it truly is. Some relationships begin to shift when the woman stops disappearing, when she stops doing emotional labor for two, when she becomes real again. Other relationships don't, and this is the part many women fear. But here is the truth that often gets missed. Knowing is safer than not knowing, because living in quiet regret requires constant self-betrayal, while facing reality, even when it's uncomfortable, restores your integrity. This stage, you don't need to decide everything. You don't need to label the relationship. You don't need to explain yourself to anyone. Your only responsibility is to stop abandoning yourself, to stay present, to stay honest, to stay connected to what you feel. From this place, Decisions stop feeling like panic responses. They become grounded movements, not driven by guilt, not driven by fear, but driven by alignment. Some women discover that when they stop carrying the relationship, their partner finally shows up. Others discover that the relationship was only standing because they were holding it alone. Both outcomes bring clarity, and clarity brings relief. Part 6 is not about endings. It's about integrity. It's about choosing to live in a way that doesn't require you to silence yourself to survive. And once you stop doing that, regret no longer has to scream to be heard, because you are finally listening.